Welcome back to the Prelude to the Trade War series. We are now discussing the city-states of Syomic. This is the third of the three southern kingdoms of man. We're talking about them second because that's the order I felt like doing it in, and I started and just got into it way too deep before I could make a decision to do otherwise. So here we are. They are not who we thought they were originally. They've come a long way in their development, and their history is very interesting in my personal opinion. So we're going to get right into it. The city-states of the Syomic princes, the tundra lords, merchants, and giant slayers of the south. Opening perspectives. On the topic of the three waves of southern migration, there are many perspectives. The first wave is often referred to as the Bloody Migration or the Cleansing Migration. This is the video we already did. This is the Sarcean migration. They are known for their aggression, especially by the Syomic people. Refer to them in only aggressive terms. More will come of them on the Syomic perspective going forward. Sarceans are fond of both insinuations. They feel it makes them appear more powerful. The second wave is also often called the Wretched Migration or the Seeker's Migration for obvious reasons. The Kingdom of Rhone favors the image of wisdom and temperance. We'll talk about them in the next video. Third wave, however, is referred to in more neutral terms. The Wayward Migration, the Or Migration by themselves, or the Wave of Apathy. While it is true that the subject of our gaze often goes unconsidered in the greater narrative of Southern history, they are still Southerners bound to the same compulsions and acts of greatness and glory that we freely attribute to their more ambitious cousins. These are the Syomic people, the namesake of the Tannic Prince Syomzes, first of the Tundra Kings. The second betrayal of Tanais. There was some debate currently as to whether or not Syomzes was a sibling to Senethos and Rhodesis, or rather if he was a cousin. That's an effort to kind of disinherit the Syomic kingdoms as legitimate to the Tannic legacy. That's not a theme I think will come up a whole lot in the book, but it's interesting to know that it's there, so that if we ever do see that place and you ever do hear something in any of the literary works that are coming about somebody saying they're not really Tannic, or they're not really connected to the rest of it like the way other people are, that's purely throwing shade. That's just saying you're too different, you're not like us, we reject it. What is known for sure is that in the year 449, Syomzes led an expedition from the Tannic homeland through Orabi, which is central Sarcia, and onward to White Ansar, and the tundra thought to be the last lesser woodland of Ansar still harboring Visan Anaku tribe residents. So that will be this region right here, which I'm not sure if you can see very well on the map, but it's the center of the very south Ansar. While he did encounter Visan, he encountered much else in White Ansar, and, like his kin Rhodesis before him, felt his mission had changed, either by internal conflict or by the demands of his environment. We'll get into the demands of his environment shortly, because that's the big factor. That's the really big one that makes this guy deviate from the purpose of which he was set out with. The first Altharian crisis. This is one of two Altharian crises in history. The second one will be coming in a later video, but this one. The Balglon River is crossed in 459, led by Syomzes and his following of roughly 3,000 warriors and 4,000 additional tribesmen. So this was a settlers' migration. It was definitely motivated by war, but there was this clear intention to settle the area once controlled. Motivated by the promise of land, wealth, and glory for slaying the enemies of their fathers, they push boldly into White Ansar, making their first encampment along the river Luxina, which is kind of hard to see from your distance to the map, but it runs from this central lake down through the center of White Ansar. And now I have to find my place on the thing again. Central to the region of White Ansar and naturally fortified is a series of hills overlooking a vast series of sparse wooded plains. Many natural highways formed from these sparse woods, allowing for ease of travels through what would otherwise be assumed to be difficult and hostile terrain. The raiding of the Visan began almost immediately, though scarce few were found in the western portions of White Ansar, and they seemed almost entirely uninterested in the new incursion of mankind into the area. Foreshadowing. Uh, the west of where they were is this southwestern tip of White Ansar, or Ansar as a whole, the southwestern tip. They were mostly in this region, along what's going, if you can see it from there, the marsh details of this region is where they found most of the Visan. But the Visan did not seem too preoccupied with them. They conflicted a little bit, and then things happened. Syomics would soon discover why when in 465 the first recorded encounter with the Giants of Ansar occurred. The singular event, the discovery of a threat greater than the Anaku, shaped the people and the direction of the Syom into the nation that it is today. Detractors will call them a nation of the greedy, a nation without pride or respect, but those who know that they are survivors, a nation with a long tradition of providing for themselves. They are defined by a strange relationship to the outside world, stemming from Syomics' letter to the courts of Centrum, the great halls of Sarsia, and the then Council of Quran, the Lords of Skur, and assumedly many other calls for aid in 467. The wording at the very bottom there has changed color for some reason, so I apologize for that. But yes, so they encounter the giants and immediately recognize that they are in a far deeper situation, or a far more threatening situation that they had originally assumed. When they originally set out, it was thought that, like, this is going to be easy. We're walking out with more dudes than we did the first time. 10 years of conflict, Sarsia got it down. They permanently control the area, it seems now. They're a dominant force in that region. Corone didn't do exactly that. We'll get to that in a later video. But they seem fine. So we're setting out with more dudes than both of them started with. Almost put together. Did not go as planned. Silence from the fatherland. This is a letter that he sent home to the courts of Tantorum, which at this point is a very loose confederation of opaque cities and settlements. This is shortly after the consolidation of Tantorum under Tanias' rule. And I believe Tanias at this time is still very much alive. So he would have been one of the people, he would have been the one receiving this letter directly. My brother and lords, a son of Tan calls upon you. We have come upon a threat far greater than the wooded men of Trinity. A race of giant men speaking a language entirely foreign to us. The use of crude weapons of stone and jade and armored themselves in the thickest layers of hides I have ever seen. Some wear the skulls of creatures I have never heard any description of. I beg ye, my fellow lords in the dukedom, send your best men. Where once I had 3,000 of the finest warriors our people could produce, I now huddle with a mere 500 against the western shores of the tundra. The giants have destroyed my encampment, nearly exterminated my army. The camp followers have all died, been taken, or fled north through the bitter cold. I have sent what's left of my champion fighters to deliver these messages to what we could consider our allies, but I fear what may come of these letters I fear what may come if these letters do not reach their destination. If we fall, they will most certainly begin tearing northward, as they have been encroaching on the Visan following our depleting of their numbers. Our old enemies have already agreed to a truce of some description. I am sorry, Father, I could not do as you asked. Please forgive me, and please do not leave your faithful men to this fate. The letter to the courts of Centrum was received poorly, with many lords declaring Syomics either a traitor or a failure. No aid came from the homeland for the men of White Ansar. So right off the bat, bad news. They encounter this huge threat. They get into a series of fights. They clearly lost. They're asking for help. They're saying it's bad. Tantorum ignores them. Just writes them off. Says, nope, that's it. We're done with the South. That's all that's happening there. A brotherly response. My brother Rhodesis, I hope this letter reaches you in good health. I am aware that we have not been in communication for some time, as you have not been with much, if not all, of your former family. I do not have time to dwell on the hurt that I may feel from what has transpired. Please just know that I do love you, brother, and I hope to at least understand one day. I write you because I need you, brother. As I am sure the Visan and your company have already made you aware of the threat of the giants in the south. You may already be sending men to combat them. I beg that you send men to the delta of Luxina as well. There I am trapped by these monsters, me and my brave warriors barely clinging to the ground we still possess. I fear we shall not last another 3 months in this position, nor will we have the space to flee the land. We have been encircled. The Visan have agreed to stay hostilities with me. I hope you will do me even more the greater kindness of coming to your brother's aid. I hope to see you again, Cher Dawn of Isus. This is an old term we had looking through stuff earlier in the book that I had written down in some of my my own journals and stuff, where Cher Dawn is supposed to signify some sort of sense of like brotherhood or ethnic kinship between groups of people. We know that Rhodesis and Xanathos, the only like common descriptor that's oftenly brought up about them, and pretty much anything I wrote down about them prior, was that they had brown hair and brown eyes. So I've just kind of attributed this term to that. That's all this is in this context, at least currently, as far as I can tell, unless I find something else that was written down at an earlier date that implies otherwise. Ronic Knights did arrive to assist Syomic, with Rhodesis himself leading the relieving war bands. This would be the start of the exclusion of Sarsia from greater southern matters, and the beginning of greater relationships between the Syom Quran and various peoples from across the great ocean. So, Rhodesis and the Kingdom of Rhone did arrive to assist Syomic in this conflict. This is kind of what opened the door to change the Syom from being on the leaning of Tantorum and Sarsia to be hostile to the Visan, and sharing in their enemies, Sarsia and Tantorum. Sarsia is really kind of like Tantorum's, little buddy that's the real kid, always on their team. The Syom very much could have been the same thing, and it's this event in history that made it not the case. It was the traitor nation, so to speak, that came to their aid, not the fatherland, or the fatherland's prime representative in the region. The apathy of Xanathos. My sister, I have lost your men, for that I express great shame. Those great warriors you gifted me have fallen, fighting a foe greater than any we have ever seen. Great Xanathos, I am little before you, but I beg you show me favor one last time. The last of mine and yours are trapped at the delta of Luxina, encircled by a race of giants. They cast magics of fire like you claim to have seen from Rhodesis men, though I no longer believe it was profane Visan sorcery like we believed. It must come from elsewhere, as the Visan themselves are at war with the beasts. They have agreed to a truce with us, and maintain their front against the giants. I beg you, sister, I need you in Macian. I am not half of even one of you, the great leaders that you are. Please send help. Xanathos, still operating under the purview of her father, responded to Syomic that she had already given him much and would not give him more. If he could not see through the Visan ruse, or if he was truly in danger, he had made peace with the very foe he had been sent to destroy, and she would not aid him. So, this is getting into a couple things this letter is revealing. One, that there's still some things that Syomic is not being open with Corone about, or kind of keeping to himself, and that apparently there is this claim that there are Ronic magics that even Syomic at this time is unsure about, that Sarsia is definitely not cool about. Also that Xanathos is viewed as kind of the greatest of them, that there's this common perception of her among her siblings that she is a great leader doing great things, and that other people kind of lessen themselves before her. A further reference to Macian, which, even though it's debated in the modern book, it'll be, if brought up in conversation, some people will just be like, he wasn't real. That's not true. This is an early reference to him and being a real person who was really there, really doing things, and the fact that he was a very accomplished leader. The beginning of the Domestican fraternity. Great Skyr kings, blessings upon your travels and your lands from the Lord of Truth. The Lord of Truth at this time can be safely inferred to be Dove. The men of Tan have need of allies at the Luxina Delta, encircled by demons of giant stature. Though you are not a glory-seeking people, I have fought alongside some of your kin in recent years. This would be Macian and his warriors, and any of them who came with him into the White Ansar. Some of my best are followers of Macian the Exiled. I beg you put aside your differences with this former association, and you will always have a friend in my father's court. I promise you, Ocean Lords, that any aid you send me now will be repaid tenfold in the coming generations. Trust in the integrity of Tan, trust in the integrity of myself. I am Syomic, son of Tanias and brother of Senethos and Rhodesis. I will make good on my promise if only you send aid. I offer land to your brave and preferential treatment to your wise. Consider us. So this is more of a business letter than the other two or other three were. This is more of a, look, help me now, I'll help you later. It's a good deal. Think about it, please. And it's worded very specifically to be... It's worded to alleviate the sense of, I know I'm going to be taken advantage of for this. He knows the deal he's making is not always going to be a good one. It's not always going to be in his or his people's favor, but it's an act of desperation. Though the response came slow, a fleet of many Skyr freemen arrived on the southern shores of White Ansar. Though not an official representation of the Domestican monarchy, the Skyr lords had given their young lords and men leave to seek their fortunes alongside the Tannic men, and several war bands formed out of the Isles of Romance. These men and their ships became instrumental to contesting the whole of the southern coast of Ansar, and later became the basis for the Syomic merchant fleet that would later become world famous for its travels. So a lot of men from the Domestican Isles showed up, largely because it was seen as a gold rush in a sense. If the land was so open because of this conflict that people could just show up, be brave, get a home, if they lived, there would be a lot of people in the what is assumed to be a now population dense, kind of a squeezed area that is the Domestican Isles. The spreading out of the Domestican identity came from this population squeeze that caused them to move to places they either had vassalage of, had colonies in. That's where you see them spread out a lot. The Syomic city-states are a very good example of that. A ton of them showed up and would continue to show up because of this population squeeze, because they saw this is a better opportunity than staying where they were. Innic friends and Sans rejection. It is believed that a multitude of letters were sent to the kingdoms of the Shatter States and a single letter to the kingdom of the Dubonians. The Shatter States would be Inura Major and Inura Minor. Though while many brave young men from the Shatter States would settle in White Ansar, there is no evidence of extensive Dubonian migration into the area. Inura is downabouts right here, just kind of barely off this map that we have. So they're about the same distance from the Syomic states as the Domestican Isles. Dubois, or the Sands people as they like to call themselves, is north of the mountains, so they're right here. So Syomics from about right here sent letters here, 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 and here, and got response from about half of them. Got backup from Corone, from the Domestican Isles way down here, and from Inura. So already, this is establishing a weird relationship dichotomy with them going into their near future, where they kind of hold a grudge against half the continent. They ran into giants. They're the only things holding them back right now, alongside the Visan, and half of the continent doesn't take that seriously, or doesn't care, or doesn't believe them, or etc., etc., etc. This kind of creates a complex of sorts, a national complex. The Sons of Syomics. For the next 26 years that this war raged on, The war band led by Syomi's, slowly taking White Ansar from its western coast outward. In this time that Syomi's took to marriage. It is in this time that Syomi's took to marriage. Taking partnership with a Ronic woman named Dizra. We don't know a whole lot about Dizra. I just know that she's there. As well as formally adopting several of his greatest warriors. No true sons of Syomi's are ever recorded, and so the lineage of the Syom is carried on through his adoptive sons of Esua, Yatorix, and Kashaka. Esua is named after this, or he shares a name with this notion of brown-hairedness, this identity. So maybe Esua was Ronic, and that's kind of where the namesake has boiled down to in our modern terminology, is that he resembles it. It also has some connection to a name back in Tantorum of a region or a city, a specific county, I think it is. So that's just an interesting name connection between him and certain concepts that exist across the greater Southern narrative. These three lines and their resulting children make up almost the entirety of modern Syomic leadership and set the example for how we live to this day. It is not well understood why Syomi's did not have any biological children, and theories range from infertility to wounds sustained during battle, leaving him unable to produce children. Few theories point to Dizra being the source of the issue, but in all likelihood, Syomi's would have produced at least illegitimate children up to this point if he had the ability to do so. Unfortunately, it seems that there's no evidence for him having passed on his genealogy in any fashion. Now, this sounds like a serious problem for the legitimacy of Syomic leadership, but truthfully it's not. The independent claims of being descended from Esua, Yatorix, and Kashaka, who are from three different places entirely. I believe Kashaka is from Inura. Yatorix is Ronic, and Esua... No, Yatorix... he might just be from... I'm not sure we ever specified where he was from. So that's actually what I might have to look into now that I'm thinking about it. But Esua is Ronic. Esua is a Ronic man. And these people would all intermarry with prominent Ronic or prominent Sarcean families in the near future, as well as intermarry with each other's families. So there's this kind of, if I can't claim to be a Syomic noble, I'm by right Tannic, a Ronic noble in some sense, and they kind of reinforce each other's claim over time in this way. Kind of like how Europe at some point all of the kings were related, so they're all backing each other up on their claims, but somehow also all own each other's land, and that's a problem. It's a thing. You know it's a thing. If you know any history, you know it's a thing. In 493, the first order of the Oer cycle was started. Syomi's told his adoptive sons they had 10 years, in which time they should travel abroad with their most loyal and make their fortunes. When they return, the whole of those fortunes would be committed to protecting the Syomic state. From the now first city of Zisi, on the delta of Luxina, 3 small fleets left home. So this is Syomic showing that of all of the descendants of Tan, he is by far the most clever. Because his solution to the problem he's facing with the Giants is going, okay, we don't have the manpower and we can't ask the world for help. At least not more than we have, because it's not giving us the edge we need. We are in a stalemate. We are locked in. What we need is raw resources. We need money. If we get money, we can buy manpower. We can buy means. We don't need to ask for them. We don't need to perform the intermarriage diplomacy, yada, 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 that we don't currently have the means to do. If we sit for another 20 years like this, game over. That's it. We don't have it. We're not that big. I think at this time, they're again a war band of around 5,000-6,000 people. With the Ronic people who came to help them, the Inurans, and the Domestican migrants that showed up. They're back about their original number, just in a better position, holding off better than they did before. And the Ronic warriors are obviously moving a little bit further into the Southlands through the woods to try to fight back the Giants as well. So they're able to pull a little bit of it aside. They're forming a bit more of a united front along the marsh there, but they're still not doing great. So they need an answer. They need something more than what they've got now. Otherwise, they're going to lose this war of attrition. And he gave them 10 years. You got 10 years. Because in that time, after that, they're probably gone. They're probably lost. 3 gifts from 3 faithful sons. The word sons has disappeared off the slide for some reason. We had a lot of trouble transferring it over to this computer today. So, again, I apologize. Just pretend the word sons is there. 10 years later, a vicious and bloody war still raging in and out of the plains and marshes that marked the border of the Deadlands. The Deadlands would be the marsh because nothing grows there. Syomic expressed in a letter to his wife that his adoptive sons were lost or had abandoned him like his father had before. We also know in this time that Rhodesis had returned home to commune with the Visan, who were now fighting much closer alongside the Syomic people. Syomic in the year 501, locked into a vicious battle at the boundary stones of the eastern tundra, had been suffering from a deep depression. He had feared that he would not make it the year and that his sons would return home to a dead land if they returned at all. Then in the winter of 501, on a full moon, during a massive attack from the giants against an ever-exhausted and fearful Syomic confederation, it felt as if the sun had risen in the middle of the night. Many horns sounded over the waves, and boats came crashing ashore. A massive fleet comprised of many ships from all over the known world began slamming to shore. Men poured out, screaming for blood and glory and waving the banner of Esua. The giants responded in kind, and the battle that ensued would become the namesake of the red fields of the eastern tundra that the city of Crudessa would be built upon. Esua had returned not just with many warriors from many lands, but many travelers and tradesmen as well. Great engineers outfitted his fleet, and from that day onward, giants would find no safety near the shores of either White Ansar or the swamps they call home. So, Esua had firmly succeeded in a very straightforward sense with his goal. He had traveled, he had become a relatively famous mercenary in that time, he had really built a name for himself, and he had gathered his own small independent army, kind of traveling. I don't have a world map here, but traveling across what would be the Mediterranean to us, the Mediterranean and the kind of outer reaches of it. He made a small army out of that, made a small fortune out of that, and showed up back home to help his father. It's also one of the things I need to talk about real quick before we move on is when we describe these tribesmen in these early years, these migrant warriors, when you think of them, you really want to think about like something between a Goth and a Celt. And what they're using, what they look like, what their culture resembles, things they like to build. They're very much defined by their environment. So places where you live, where these people live, where there isn't a whole lot of wood, but there's a ton of stones to work with, they're going to build things out of that. But you'll always be able to find a commonality in kind of the flowiness of their art, the naturalism of their art when it comes to connections to the land in which they live, and the equipment they use, the clothes they use. All from Tantorum to the Siom to Corone, these people all wear something you could pretty easily recognize as classical attire. And they're very, very attached to that traditional appearance. The equipment they use is stuff that, in reference to, these guys are the Westerners of their world, of their time and place. They're specifically the far northern Westerners of their time and place. And their culture resembles that a lot. So when you picture these tribesmen, picture them as something out of some of the classical stories of our day, in our time, that you may or may not know off the top of your head. If you don't know them, I'd suggest you go read them, and really look for information about who these people were like, who you and how they looked and what their cultural expressions were, and that will give you a sense of what these tribesmen are like and look like and act like. Except for these guys are at a different developmental period. They're a lot more and less advanced in different ways than their real world counterparts. Less than 2 months after, Eutorix returned as well, less successful than his brother with men but more with money. He would go on to found the city of Malyara, along the river Boglon, which was referenced in the Sarsia video. It's kind of the border river between these two places. I lost my spot again. Along the river Boglon, where the tundra and Orabi met. He would trade to the north for all the tundra was worth, and his image is still impressed on the majority of Syomic currency. So this is your true merchant prince. Asua is a prince who happens to be a merchant. Eutorix is a true merchant prince. Him and his line, all they do is make money for the country. They are known for being ingenious in their mercantile tactics. These are the guys who compete directly with the skewer for being the best, I guess, tradesmen, merchant sellers, buy, sell guys in the world. They compete directly with them, and that's a source of a lot of respect between these two groups of people. In 503, Kashaka returned in a single ship. Many believed that he had utterly failed in his task. Yet he returned from the farthest reaches of the world with something rare. A single flower from a place said to be so hostile in its environment that men died if not from the frostbite through the cold winds surrounding it, then from the poisons of the caves that it came from. A citadel was built around it that would later become the fortress city of Dantisa, and much later the Tidari would take over its cultivation. This flower became the means by which men communed with the sea and the god Muan, and it would later become the one thing that the Syomic merchants would never sell. This is alluding to the psychedelic nature of spirituality in the South and the Southern cults. This is something that other cultures, especially the one they came from in Tantorum, might not approve of, might not be cool with, might see as profane. For the Syom, this is normal. And this is kind of how they get into that zone where they talk to that thing beyond them. I'm actually going to take a drink of water before we move on, because this is hard. I bought Life Water because everybody says it's good. It just tastes like water to me. Small steps towards great friendship. In 515, the establishment of what would come to be seen as a permanent alliance between the soon-to-be merchant princes of the Syom and the Skewer Lords was cemented with the establishment of the coastal city-state of Kria on the southwestern tip of White Ansar. Right down here. There's actually... The camera quality doesn't seem like it's reaching all the way, but there's a bay right here, kind of reaching in to this southern peninsula here. And Kria kind of surrounds the top of that bay. Though it functioned as a skewer trade city, the city itself answered to the merchant princes. The governor of that city would in time be considered a position of merchant prince itself, the last of the eventual 13 that would exist today. 3 of the sons of Syom, and this one of the lords of the Skewer, another promise kept by the merchant king. The city of Kria would act as the largest doorway of goods and manpower in and out of White Ansar for years to come, and is still among the largest and most prosperous ports in the region. So, the Skewer like to work their way into cultures, and that's kind of how they protect themselves. If we're a little bit a part of everybody, nobody wants to mess with us, and everybody depends on us. This relationship that's kind of what the Syom have going on at this time, and what it slowly evolves into is the fact that the Skewer, who are this empire of money, think of them kind of like a world bank. Not in the sense that they're trying to control everybody's currency, but in the sense that if they can control the flow of all things, they will, because that's what keeps them safe. And that's their primary concern, is their survivability. They're just like any other group of people on the map. This was their whole thing to, this is how we make ourselves necessary to the world. This is how we make ourselves indisposable. The Seom is going to be one of these few places where they feel like they're among people who understand and compete at the game at the same level they have. They're the oldest empire on the map currently, coming from the Domestic Isles down here. I believe there's an earlier video on them. And they have a lot of control of this region that surrounds Ansar and Atria and all of that. They're just all over the place. So for them to have somebody on this map who they view as kind of like, oh, these guys do what we do at the same level we do, and we have a connection to them that runs deeper than simply trying to control the market so that they need us. We have a connection with these guys that runs to, we feel like we can actually talk to them. That if we feel attacked, we can count on them to back us up. It's a very strange relationship for them to have, and it kind of sets the Seom apart. That they are so connected to the Domestic Isles. And not just a mercantile sense, but now as time goes on, trade cities exist all over this region. And this one's not just a trade city, it's a member of the family, so to speak. The first trespass. In 550, the signs of international tension occurred. Sorry, I'm going to restart that one. In 550, the first signs of international tension occurred due to trespasses by Dubonian explorers, who landed on the Giants Peninsula and established a camp with the intentions of fighting their way inward and seeking treasure. Though the Giants control the peninsula, the Swamplands are agreed to be Syomic territory upon annexation, apart from the centralmost Blackstone citadels, which are agreed to be Ludnese, or in reality, Ronic holdings as payment. The invading Dubonians refused the message to abandon their campaign, even when offered compensation. They were expelled by force at much risk to ourselves due to the Giants' presence. Several surviving vessels made haste back to the Dubonian homeland, establishing firmly to them that they are currently neither welcome in the Seom nor the Rhone. So this is alluding to conflicts that are currently happening in another part of the world, in the Kingdom of Rhone. They are not getting along with the Sans people. But also like to point out that Sans and Dubonian. Sans is what they call themselves. Dubonian is what Southerners call them because we're making fun of them. And I refer to them exclusively as Dubonians pretty much 100% of the time because I wrote the whole Southern lore, and from a Southern perspective, we don't refer to them by their chosen name. We refer to them by how we choose to refer to them, which is kind of insultingly. And this is part of that old history of we don't get along. They set foot in the Giants Peninsula as adventurers looking for treasure. This is not an unusual phenomenon. Lots of other people do this. But when they did it, the Seom said, no, you don't get to. We just don't like you. They even, and the further thing is, this cemented their dislike of them because they tried to pay them to leave and they didn't take it. And the Seom would say, look, we made you a reasonable offer. Now we have an unreasonable relationship. So there we go. The shift from knights to mariners. Following this event, there was a drastic increase in piracy and naval conflict on the seas to the west and south of the Seom. While the Skewer Lords were able to keep much of the central seas safe, their reach only extended so far. This necessitated an expansion of the martial tradition for the Syomic people, who, while not lacking ships, have largely been able to avoid naval conflict up to this point, for much of the local sea was secured by organized governance. What we're getting into now is, as relationships between establishing nations on this map move from neutral to frayed or distant, they stop looking out for each other. And so if you were a Dubonian pirate or a Syomic pirate, well, now your own people aren't going to care too much if you prey upon each other. And that's happening there, of course. That's also happening in other parts of the world as well, which is leading to some messy situations. Many cultures record this period of time from around the 600s to the 1000s as somewhat of a dark age for civilization. Our own records state, however, that there was simply far more expansion than there was organization. We remained focused as the threat of the giants was ever looming as we had to become ever stronger. So, this showed up in the Circean video for a little bit, where there's periods of time where there's just not a whole lot of new information to be had. And a big part of that is there just was nothing written down about them. So we have to assume the jump was kind of like a dark age, where things happened, things changed clearly. Because for Sarcia, for example, from how they look in the year 700 to how they look in the year 1000 is radically different. But how that change happened is uninformed. It's lost to time. Or just currently. It's not known. For Sarcia, it was a mess. For the Syom, it was a fairly normal thing. They just, or not a normal thing, I'm sorry. It didn't happen. They don't have strange, huge periods of time where no information is lost until almost the modern era. And that's almost deliberate, even. While up to this point, the outfitting of Syomic warriors had been fairly standard for the time, the wealthy and the leadership being more heavily armed and armored, usually serving in cavalry units, the advent of piracy caused Syomic leaders, and even well-moneyed groups of soldiers, to begin to favor lighter armor and more maneuverable armors to accommodate for the likelihood of dealing with pirates during a young prince's ore journeys. So this is they're moving away from worrying about land conflict with their neighbors. Oh, another point. Let's get there first. The habit of being lightly armored was only reinforced by prolonged conflict with the giants of South Ansar, as generally a high degree of protection made no difference when being struck with a weapon the size of one's own body. So, the Syom has absolutely no incentive at this point in time to invest in heavy armor, essentially. Heavy armor and heavy armor penetrating weapons are maybe necessary in the form of, giants, thick leather, hided armors, thick skin in general. They're giants. But for their own personal protection, there's just no reason for them to wear extremely heavy-duty, expensive stuff. Because in the case of the oceans, you don't want to fall off your boat and sink like a rock. Not that many more heavier armors like chainmail would necessarily cause that, but they want to be as unfatigued as possible in those settings, because usually what they're fighting to do is get away. They're not fighting to take the enemy ship. They're not trying to have a prolonged engagement. They're trying to get away. So as far as protection is concerned, they're trying to protect themselves from ranged attacks at sea, and they're trying to be more maneuverable and capable when it comes to uncertain footing, in the case of like boarding. And when it comes to giants, maneuverability is key again as well. You're going to be riding around on horses, trying to stay out of reach, and if you're on foot, you want to be able to get out of the way of whatever's coming because you're not stopping it. They're giants. You're getting hit with a club that probably weighs 15 times you, depending on what it's made out of and the size of the giant. There's no shield, there's no armor for that. There's just hopefully getting out of the way. The introduction of Ma'ana. Around the year 568, a soon-to-be famous merchant prince named Damon Na Asua returned from his ore cycle at the age of 36, bringing with him nearly 8 full holds of a strange substance that would change medical science in the Syom and neighboring countries forever. At this point in time, we've seen the name Asua many times. Na Asua means of Asua. So that's a strong namesake to have. This is clearly a line known for being very adventurous, for being very bold. It's certain, I think in the Rhone they would refer to this as a heroic line. Not to say that it's necessarily special, but heroic as a tendency, as an action. The substance known as Ma'ana in the Far East would be used to cause grievously wounded individuals to enter a state of near-suspended animation after ingesting. Skin dries, blood clots to near gelatinous degree, and organs fully relax as the patient goes comatose. This substance, after being studied, was found to be easily synthesized from any plant retaining sufficient metallic content inside its leaves, usually plants that grow on mountains or near deposits of cuve. All that must be added thereafter is the ma powder, which is imported from the Far East nation of Dao on a constant basis. The use of the elixir has allowed Syomic surgeons to reset bones and stitch wounds that would have long since killed men in the field. So it's this singular powder that we can't make on our own, that we import from the Far East, mixed with a base of something. You take a leaf and you kind of boil and burn it down to its metallic content. You have to do a lot of that, but it's perfectly doable in large numbers. And it's in the Syom, being that it's a tundra with a very short harvest cycle, a very short things aren't covered in ice and snow for no reason cycle. You'll see that when the snow melts and it you get this short growing cycle, there's just a ton of activity around farming at that time. It's like 2 months where you can grow stuff. There's just the whole country gets covered in crops. Don't know where I had another thought. I lost it though, so we're just going to move on. Many postulate that this early adaptation of Ma'ana is what permitted the Syomic states to maintain such a strong presence both locally and internationally. Though a man missing a leg would almost certainly never fight pirates or giants again, he could properly find his place in a society that treated him with respect and dignity. He may pick up a trade and father a family and teach his bravery and commitment to his children. The effectiveness of this substance in preserving life necessitated positively the construction of extensive medical facilities, called ostachas and staffed by ostas. At least one ostacha is present in every city-state in the Syom, the Grand Ostacha in the city of Crudessa, where the Ostas Guild is centered. So this is something you'd notice about the Syom visiting it that you don't notice about other places. A lot of cripples. A lot of people who are scarred, a lot of people who have been maimed, and it's because they've survived things that people in other societies and other conflicts or situations just wouldn't. There are certain mercenary groups out of the Syom that are known for looking particularly messed up. What this is also given way to is in the Syom, having scars or having blemishes, especially from conflict or from difficulties in life, has become a sign of attractiveness and kind of nobility. That, if you see a dude walking around without an arm, he's not perceived very negatively in any way in the Syom. He's perceived as heroic, because chances are he lost that arm to a giant. You don't get a whole lot more man than that. The one-armed giant fighter who's retired and become a pig farmer or a blacksmith or a horseman, yeah, he's pretty well respected in his local community. And he's probably considered very much a catch, because typically, that happens. Maybe he's like 28 at the time. He had a good military career, but then he got hurt and now he can't do it anymore. He's going to do fine. That guy's going to do fine in this society. In other societies, maybe not so much. In this one, this is very unique to the Syom. He's going to be great. He's going to do just fine. The changing governance of the Syom. In the year 612, a territory conflict between the city-state of Crudessa and the young city of Eresis. Yes, Eresis. I wrote that word a long time ago, and now I forgot how I said it. Though the fighting was brief, it resulted in severe damage for the young city of Eresis. Following the conflict, the now 12 merchant princes gathered to resolve the conflict diplomatically, largely using the threat of occupying both cities for the common defense as leverage to cease the fighting. At this conclave of princes, the Treaty of the White Princes was established, limiting the total number of princes to 12, directly in correlation to the equitable distribution of land between the now 12 city-states of the Syom. Among other things, establishing that all disputes between city-states would be resolved at a conclave, at least at an annual basis, as well as outlining the obligations from each city towards the defense against the giants and the growing concerns of hostile elements growing jealousy of Syomic wealth. A growing sense of paranoia had come about in this time as well, as Syomic families intermarried with close neighbors in Orabi, the Rhone, and the Domestican Isles, that they seemingly grew increasingly distant from other trade partners in Dubois and Lyria, mirroring the xenophobic social perspectives of their Scian and Rhonic neighbors. So, what we have here is a short kind of domestic conflict incident. And again, showing this is kind of the legacy of Siomzes, the instant, smart, clever, on the draw, quick. They immediately go about setting up that, look, there's only going to be this many cities. These are going to be the regions controlled by those cities. And any conflict with those cities is going to be resolved at a conclave where we meet annually at the minimum. And anybody who tries to break that, we all jump them. And so now you have this kind of setup where the Siom is considered an extremely stable place in a governmental sense, because despite the fact that you have 12 princes, they're not looking at each other's land. Because even if one gets a little bit like, I think I could pull something off, he's gonna get attacked by literally everybody else the moment he succeeds. So you can't do that. Yes, and in this time as well, it went on to talk about they're pulling back. Who they're willing to talk to and trade with is getting a little bit more narrow. Still very broad compared to other countries at the time. Their trade lanes reach very far, but locally they're getting a little bit more picky. Northern tension. Around the year 680, a young prince returning from his oracycle by the name of Leorix na Dentisa is arrested and convicted of piracy in the nation of Elengir. His ships seized in port, most of his crew killed, and his capture publicly announced sparks a long series of diplomatic incidents between the cities of Siom and the nation of Elengir, resulting in a formal war in 686. Elengir is to the northeast of the Siom. It's kind of right across the pond to Dubois to the east. This war was costly, and despite the seafaring tradition of the Syomic people, they found themselves outmatched on the waves. Though if their time in Ansar had taught them anything, it was perseverance. Elengir found it impossible to stop all the Syomic ships from making landfall, where they often found success in raiding coastal settlements. The challenge then being making it home. After 2 decades of war, the Syomic people finally found their breakthrough after incursions of southern warriors managed to raid 4 coastal cities in 1 year, resulting in the offering of tribute from Elengir despite disproportionate losses on the end of the Syomic state. Conflicts with Elengir and Dubois would become repeat occurrences, with conflicts ranging from disputable acts of piracy to formal conflicts resulting in coastal raids. Dubois and Elengir would find it impossible to make an inland incursion against the Siom due to consistent support from their cousins in the Rhone, either due to common defense or large payments from the Siom's ever-deepening treasury. So, Elengir and Dubois are going to go on to become closer, and at this time they're already kind of working together. And there's shared disdain of Southerners, and their disregard for local law is going to be what sparks a lot of this. That merchant prince by the name of Leorix likely was arrested on piracy because he was committing acts of theft, and he was very unlikely that he actually attacked somebody. But what's more likely is he was probably buying and selling illegal things and not paying tariffs and yada yada. And Elengir went, okay, that's jail time. That's obviously the Syomic princes. They have a very simple system of I trade to you. There's not a whole lot in between that. Anything traded up to the merchant prince is like they're the best merchants around. They don't need a whole lot of taxes from us. Other countries obviously have a very different view on this, and so this would cause conflict with Syomic merchants who just would not necessarily want to abide by those rules. They don't deal with it at home, they don't understand it, or they do understand it, they don't like it. And this guy must have taken too firmly a stand, and it resulted in an international incident. The inclusion of the Siom in the southern cults. In the year 715, a Rhonic diplomat would arrive in the city of Crudessa on behalf of the Visan-Anaku, expressing a desire to reintegrate certain holy sites into the eastern segments of the Siom into Visan territory, as well as loosening the border tension between the Visan and Syomic people. Over several months, a formal declaration of friendship was formed. on the strong basis of their joint conflict with the giants of South Ansar and on the word of their cousins in the Rhone. Neighboring merchant princes would follow suit, seeing the economic and social benefits of a whole half of the country having a stronger guarantee of safety for merchants and travelers. With this formal declaration came the Tidari, who over the course of several years took over control of the cults of Muon, Betasak, and Ruham, and bringing with them the cults of Althair and Betha. Though it would not be discussed in the open until much later, the worship of Betasak, Krykos, and other languages would seem to be a common element among some Dubonians, Rhonic people, the Visan, the Siom, and the giants throughout much of pre-Tidarian history. So we see a lot of iconography of Krykos all throughout this whole region of the far southern Siom. And it seemed that everybody kind of became attached to the idea of him being a god even before there was an organized push for him to be. He's one of the older forms of worship in that region. Krykos being the god of the seas. Why this is, we don't know. We just know that there's reverence for the ocean across that whole area. Before we move on, I'm going to take another drink of water, so have fun staring at me while I do that. I don't know why I announce when I'm taking drinks, but I'm not going to stop, and you can't stop me. Something ancient. In the year 717, the ancient caverns of Ro-Ruad were documented and mapped out. Though long abandoned, many ancient artifacts were found in what was thought to be an ancient work site, large quarries of jade and mining shafts all buried underground. The size of the constructions are more appropriate for the giants than for the Visan, with the relics found suggesting that the giants did inhabit the site for a considerable amount of time. Jade tools, ancient skulls of mysterious beasts coated in metals, and jade tools seemingly lacking any practical use. Many of the carvings within the caverns seem to allude to worship of the moon, communion with the lunar soul, seemingly a major focus of the culture that resided in the caverns. Tidari documented the findings and continued to study the caverns well into the modern day. Two prevailing theories exist among the Tidari, that either the giant's presence in White Ansar predates the Visan presence, or that so much time has passed in prehistory for the humans that long-term occupation could be obtained and lost and seemingly lost to antiquity. The site has been protected by local merchant princes at the behest of the Tidari, and the cultivation of the sacred flower has been moved to the cavern as a perfect environment for the sacred plant. So, what they found down there was something. We talk about Blackstone fortresses in other areas. These ancient structures we found, we don't know who built them. This is one of those, but buried. It's underground. It's not known whether or not all Blackstone fortresses are buried. Most of them seem smaller than this thing turns out to be. And so maybe we're just seeing the entrance to large underground complexes, or maybe partially buried complexes. But the Siom is the only people who have like a straight shot into one, direct access and full control. There are other complexes very similar to this in the Trinity Forest, in the far north, in the marshes, and I believe up here in the mountains where the plague is. This is the only one that people have just found and been able to work with, and it's given way to some strange discoveries. Primarily that they find, in this second point here, it differentiates between jade tools and jade tools seemingly lacking a purpose. Meaning they find things that they know were meant for something practical because they're with all the other practical stuff. You know, it's not like it's hanging off the wall as a decoration, but they have no clue what certain objects are used for. So whether it's lost technology or just a really specific way of doing something that we now have a different way of doing, or who knows, they keep them, they study them, but discoveries are going to be slow on this. Because it's, you know, it's a monkey looking at a monolith, essentially. We found something big. We have no way to fully understand what this is at this point in time. The Age of Discovery. The background of this one is one of those aforementioned, what was this supposed to be, tools. From the 700s onward, many discoveries that would, from the 700s onward, many discoveries that would radically alter the Syomic culture would come from the discoveries of this underground complex. Largely the inclusion and use of fire magics for the sake of creating more ornate tools and weapons made from pure forms of stone, such as jade, granite, amethyst, and jasper. Fire magics, we're back to that. So, where this comes from becomes clear in the Syomic histories with this right here. The fire magics are something discovered, left behind by something more ancient than, assumedly, the giants, the Visan, and mankind. Because they're all discovering it independently. It's not something given or taught, it's something discovered. Largely in the form of old manuscripts, and maybe worship sites, or maybe by mystical experience, by using older religious artifacts. Who knows? But this is where it comes from. The strange combination of magics that formulate in the creation of these tools allows them to be of equal hardness and usefulness to their bronze and iron counterparts. Bronze and iron. The words for those appropriately are, I believe, Kramos and Kuv. So that was an editing failure. It has also brought about new or exceptionally old styles of fashion and cultural expression that would take hold over the next few hundred years. Certain styles that became commonplace were remarked by the Visan to be archaic but recognizable to themselves. And all discoveries finding practical places amongst the population of the Syomic people. So this is like... This is a technology jump for the Syom. At this point in time, they're learning from the fact that they interact with so much of the world at a time, so they're a very diverse collection of ideas. This is the thing that comes from them. This is the thing that is really like, this is us, that separates us, not just from the world we interact with, not from the fact that we exist kind of globally, but also from our homeland. This is the thing that sets us apart from Tantorum. This is what sets us apart from the Senians and from the Ronic people. The only practice discovered to this day largely attributed to the giants is the reverence of skulls of both strange ancient animals and their own kind. So they find these skull shrines and they're like, that's giants. We know that's giants. We know that's just them. They made that up on their own. Because we don't see anything else like that in any other group of people. So they carry that with them from wherever they came from. The exploration of the world was largely undertaken by Skur and Syomic sailors. Though there are and would be greater sailors across the world, there would be none so adventurous as the Syomic princes. The open dialogue with the Domestican Isles would allow for exceptionally accurate and informative acts of cartography, at least for the era and possibilities of the time. Much of the shores of the land to the east and west were mapped by the Skur, and the rivers and inlands would be further mapped by the Syomic merchant princes. So the Skur don't like going deep into places where they can't fall back on their navy for strength. The Skur are a little bit more adventurous than that. This is where we don't have a world map on hand right now, but much of what we know about the world map around us comes from Skur cartography. A little bit of it comes from people having allies and getting maps from their allies and incorporating them into their own maps. But if you're really wondering, like, nobody's been here, who figured out what this unconnected place actually looks like, how do we know? It's the Syom. The Syom would be the people who go there and find out. Mostly because they're trying to figure out if there's anything there useful to them, because they're in a desperate bid to constantly increase their own wealth and power due to this unending conflict with the giants, which is still going on. It's going to continue going on, and that's just a common thing for them. A thing for them is they never stop fighting the giants. Trouble with a cousin nation. Life continued as described in the Syom until 1099, with discoveries slowly trickling out of the ancient caverns, and the wealth and fighting power of the Syomic states steadily growing. The War of the Giants remained at a stalemate, proving time and time again that they were as defensively capable as the Southmen, and that the border of the swamp almost existed as an agreement as much as a war front. That the war would seemingly be retained to that single front until modern history. So we're getting pretty close to modern here. We're about 500 years off. That border is going to stay static until about right here, is going to stay static until about the modern era. And the reason that feels strange is it's almost like every push into it that, oh, we're going to push harder than we did last year, they push back harder. We push lighter, they push back lighter. It's this weird thing that's going on with them. We don't know why they do it. It might just be them conserving their forces. It might be that they feel as threatened in this war of attrition as we do. So they don't want to throw everything they have into one bid in case they lose and suddenly everything's lost. We're sweeping in, wiping the rest of them out. But that's how that's happening. What did change at this point is the civil war of the Syomic Confederacy, which resulted in a multitude of social difficulties for the Syomic states. Refugees from all walks of life fled into the Syomic states, resulting in northern city-states needing to allocate resources to housing, handling, and relocating large populations of migrants to the areas that could better handle them. Not only this, plainsman raids regularly reached into the tundra, creating border friction and tense relations between the city-states and the Syomic Confederacy. Though the histories of Sarsia seldom mention it, great quantities of wealth were regularly gifted to the monarchy of Sarsia to aid in getting control of the further flung and wilder reaches of the country in an effort to repair the damage done to both countries by the Syomic loss of control. So the Syomic Civil War, one of the things that we don't talk about in their history, because they don't want to talk about it, is that the plainsman raiders weren't just conflicting with the Syomic monarchy. They started attacking or raiding neighboring regions as well. They acted in a very mercenary kind of bandit fashion. Obviously, this creates problems because the Syomic monarchy is responsible for these guys. How do you have so little control of your people that they're attacking our people now? What's happened here? Is kind of the Syomic perspective. Like you have that. This is very irresponsible, essentially. Following the Second Syomic Civil War of 1134, however, payment would cease, and all incursions, raids, or suspicious crossings into the tundra would simply be met by force. The Council of Princes would unanimously denounce the Syomic monarchy as incompetent, and instead direct resources towards the increasing defenses and security in the direction of Sarsia, rather than treating it as a cousin nation as they had before. For what it's worth, few Syomic raids made it past the border from then on. So now we have genuine hostility between these two countries. Going into the modern era, this would continue. They kind of still dislike Sarsia as a place that doesn't control itself very well and doesn't represent itself very well. They view them as uncouth, is a good word for it. Water. The era of strife. It is in this same time period, from the 1130s onward, that tension between the Syomic states and the northern alliance of Etrovia, Dubois, and Elengir would vastly increase, largely due, in honest, to merchant princes refusing to pay tariffs and taxes to any of the northern countries for passing through their waters or trading at their markets. We were universally declared to be recognized as a lawless pirate nation by the Northern Alliance and all of their subject states in the east. This resulted in difficulties in acquiring certain resources that the Syomic had become accustomed to or reliant on, including the ma'ana that the Syomic medical science was extremely dependent on. Many young merchant princes would brave the hostile waters, but only about a third of the princes who took on such a journey would usually return. As it turned out, the boundaries of nature, language, and diplomacy were much easier boundaries to overcome for the Syomic people than was organized opposition on the great waters. So this goes back to Syomic people are clever, and up to this point they've proven they're great warriors. They fight the giants, but now they're facing something they're not really ready for. They're facing this unified alliance that studied them, that knows what they're like and knows how to deal with them. And more than that, because they're so organized, they have the numbers to never really be caught off guard. So it's getting more difficult for the Syomic to operate in that area. These odds would begin to change in our favor as time went on, but only with great expenditure and adaptations. The Skewer had gotten by on being the earliest and oldest iteration of organized naval warfare, while the Tauric Navy was quickly beginning to outmatch them by merit of technology and tactics alone. The Tundra Princes would take lessons from both cultures, as well as some of our far-flung trading allies, in creating independent specialized naval fleets. Though the Syomic Armada would never outnumber the Skewer, nor would it ever outfight the Tauric, it would eventually become feared for its sheer unpredictability due to the vast array of technologies and tactics employed by individual merchant princes and their fleets. By the year 1250, the Syomic Navy would be the fourth strongest in the Atrian sphere, behind the Dubonian, Tauric, and Domestican armadas. So what the Syom's solution to this era of like increasing naval conflict and increasing naval technology was they weren't going to standardize, they were going to specialize. So if you were trying to, say, make a danger run through the shared waters to the northeast between Dubois and Elendgur, you're probably outfitting yourself with small, quick ships, good for getaways, good for sliding in and out. Not necessarily big punch-out fights, not having a ton of men ready to go, but just getting by, just quickly fly past. Fast ships, let's get out of here, let's go. Whereas if you were, a merchant prince established in recruiting and really kind of putting the fear of God into the enemies of the Syom, you're probably rocking something much larger, much more punchy, much more, we put ballistas and catapults on this thing, and we have, 400 fighting men on one boat ready to board, and yada, yada, yada. So they became very, you don't quite know what you're dealing with when you see a Syomic flag on the border. You just don't quite know who they're sending, and who they're sending is going to determine a lot about what you have to deal with from then on, if you're conflicting with them navally, which at this point in time, Dubois and Elendgur are very openly, having almost constant hostilities with the Syom on the waters. The War for Yesua. In the year 1282, we're jumping a little bit now, because as modern time goes on, we're dealing more with phenomenons than massive historical events. But this would be one massive historical event. In the year 1282, a massed incursion from the kingdom of Elendgur pierced through the southern mountains into the border of the kingdom of Yesua. Being a client state of the Domestican Isles, the Skewer lords massed a relief force and sent for the Peninsula nation immediately. Yesua is... I don't have a world map. It's a little peninsula nation in the form of a point hanging off the bottom of the kingdom of Elendgur, separated by a mountain range. So that mountain range forms a natural border, and Elendgur crossed it, clearly with conquest in mind. But fearing a drawn-out conflict, called the merchant princes to intervene on their side as well, citing their assistance in the now antiquated conflicts with the giants. The merchant princes answered, to which 6 of the Tundra princes in power responded with their own respective armies and fleets. Though the war was over in 6 years, ending in 1288, ongoing skirmishes and conflicts against the mountains and waters surrounding it would go on well into the mid-1300s, making the second time officially that the nation of the Syom and the Skewer lords had fought a common foe together. So we have the further cementing of their alliance to the Domestican Isles, kind of that further evidence of these guys view each other in a different way than they view the rest of the world. An increase in tension further with Elendgur, from the Syom standpoint. This kind of sets the stage for that area in the modern times. That things are going to go forward the next 300 or 400 years, that this is something fresh in the mind. That, okay, this is how we're dealing with each other now. The occupation of the Macedonic Empire. So we talked about this a bit in the Sarcean video as well. In 1350, the Tauric invasion of the southern kingdoms began. By 1357, the Syan Confederation had fallen. Ignorantly, we believed that may have been the end of the advance. Tauric forces continued to push into the tundra. 4 northern cities were sieged and relief was sent. Though we would push off the Tauric invaders at first, the writing was on the wall. Now spread out between conflicts with Elendgur, the Giants, and Tantorum, we were not able to replenish our front as fast as the Mezoks and their subjects from the shattered states of Anura and their new Syan levies. Though our resistance had earned us leverage to bargain favorably, agreements of tribute were drafted in 1369, leaving the Syon much of its autonomy and manpower. We were able to pay with our considerable wealth rather than with blood or land. More so, though we now paid a hefty tax to the Mezoks, they did subsidize and the further development of our fleets. We were lucky that we shared some common foes, and that they were eager to see the Anurans and Dubonians harried as we were. And with some careful planning, we were able to continue to conceal much of our more arcane and exceptional knowledge in the Blackstone complex buried under the bluffs of the southern tundra, going back to that site that all of those ancient discoveries are pouring out of. They were able to keep it secret and conceal many of the things that the Tauric or the Mezoks might consider profane underneath it or inside it. They were able to keep it hidden. The Tidari, great teachers and philosophical leaders, proved in this time also to be great keepers of secrets. Had the Mezoks discovered the source of our great stone working and artworks, or the source of our religious rituals and the sacred flower, they may have very well been lost to us forever. In this time, the Tidari would also reveal some of our secrets to our domestic and allies, preserving some of our most important knowledge should the Mezoks come to discover our sacred hiding places. We knew this would lose us leverage over them in some mercantile affairs, but the prospects of losing such important discoveries to history was far more harrowing. Besides, nobody can do what Tundra Princes do quite as well as Tundra Princes. Authenticity will always have its price. So, the threat of losing the secrets of fire magics, having those stamped out, the stoneworking, the sacred flower, and the ancient styles and workings that are coming from this place, the thought that Tantorum might see that and go, no, and eliminate it was scary enough to the Syon that they gave a bunch of it or shared the knowledge of it and relics of it with their domestic and allies, which means now they have a way to study it on their own. They don't need the Syon for this necessarily anymore. But again, it's a display of trust between these two places. I can't sell you fancy jade tools anymore that you don't know how to make, because now you know how to make them. But understand, I'm afraid this practice is going to be gone forever, and I need you to help me protect that. So people from the outside view this as just like, why would they do this? You know, this is a bad merchant move. Why wouldn't they be like selling this to everybody, basically? And it's because despite the appearance of the merchant princes being greedy, there are things they care about far more than money. And this knowledge is one of those things. This connection to whatever's going on in this land is very sacred to them. Taxation, freedom, and the power of the coin. Much of the Syomic development ground to a halt under the reign of the Mesotonic Empire, largely due to the necessity of moving many of our sacred arts underground. Though the Tidari and Sarsia were left unharried, the merchant princes felt it prudent to express secrecy, where they knew their Syon cousins would likely do the opposite. They were right. It just turned out, luckily, that Tantorum was not very hostile to foreign religious practice. And this time they're developing an age of reason and rationale. The princes did, however, gain access to the Tauric brown corbot, a violently combustive substance that proved extremely effective in certain regards to combating the giants and providing an advantage against Illic naval vessels. The eventual development of early firearms would never mean much or be widely adopted by Syomic, but cannons and tar fire would become favorites of Syomic mariners and military architects. So, Tantorum's having its gunpowder revolution in this time. The Syon doesn't find much use for it, as it turns out. Giants view it like getting shot with a BB, essentially. It doesn't seem to affect them much, but a cannon's a cannon. It does what cannon do. So obviously they start taking advantage of that among their other siege equipment, especially as far as if it's affordable, if they can get good access to it for good value, they're going for that. And when they can't, but they need it, they got all the money in the world as far as they're concerned. But also for their naval conflicts that are still ongoing in these these eastern waters, against shared hostiles between them and Tantorum, they begin employing this stuff to great effect in naval combat. So now you have this fear from these eastern states that while they're also catching up in advancement and coming up with ways to combat it, they're seeing the Seom as a greater and greater threat. These weird little pirate princes are only getting more and more dangerous as time goes on. And they're only getting more and more weird and expressive too. So they don't see, like, the Seom's clearly in a state of, despite their occupation, they're still in the rise of the cultural circumstance. They haven't peaked, and they're not declining. So their enemies are like, we now need to figure out how to bring them down. Because if they keep going like this, they're going to win. The princes, okay. As the Macedonic Empire burned out its own flame with relentless warfare towards the stone walls that was the northern kingdoms, that's Lyria, Dubois, Etrovia, conflicts with those guys up there, the Syomic princes saw an opportunity to regain their freedom in a way that would be sweet to the minds of both parties. A substantial payment, an ongoing favorable trade agreement to the Tauric nation, and the promise that all manpower that could have been building to win Syomic freedom by bloodshed would then be directed at the old Ilic and Dubonians' sensitive trade lanes. So what they're saying is, look, say all these things you're getting from us that you've become dependent on, say you still get them. You get them for good deals, good prices, and that threat that we will rebel because now you're spread out too thin, we won't do that. We won't send, that's not a message we need to send. Wink. But we will, as soon as we know you're going to leave us alone, double down on messing with these guys up here. Say we do all that. You let us go. We don't have to pay you tribute anymore. And we say we're just really awkward friends for a while. The Ronic Rebellion had surely had them questioning the force of their grip as well, laying bare how thinly spread their forces had become. Tantorum, eager for security, stability, and reliable allies, jumped on the opportunity and surely welcomed the opportunity to appear both at home as well as internationally as benevolent overlords, willing to release a child state that had grown past the need for an overlord. In 1617, the Tannic Trade Circle was founded and the Syomic independence was secured. So right off the bat, Syom gets independence and goes like, all right, let's make a treaty out of it. We're free. You get good deals. This local trade deal we've got going on, we're putting that to paper so that nobody else on the continent gets any funny ideas. That we're a fresh target to be used against you. We're agreeing to not be that. We're not necessarily your friend, because you just occupied us for 300 years, but we're not going to be one of the thorns in your side. We're not looking for an opportunity to get you. We're doing the opposite. We're trying to reinforce the stability of the region, because if you fall apart, that's bad news for us as well, because now we have to worry about what's north of you becoming a threat to us, just like Dubois and Elengir has. They don't have that fear of Adrana, so to speak, but of Lyria, there's some concerns. Not like it's manifested yet, but there's some concerns. And that's the thing is, the whole of the South eventually develops this notion of we don't trust the Northerners. We don't trust the northern states. We like maybe things around us to the west and east, not Elengir. We like maybe some things across the waters, but the northern states are a direct competition to feeling safe and secure in our own environment here. Looking forward. Following the years of conflict, the princes of the Seom would realize the awkwardness of sharing so many foes with their former overlord. Though it was notionally uncomfortable, treaties of non-aggression and defensive alliance would be maintained into the modern era to address joint threats to both peoples. One prince in particular, Leorix Nazesi, so we get this renaming convention with princes to get them, it's kind of like a double legacy. Leorix named after the prince who, to them, he was arrested for being a Jesus Christ. Leorix was the name of that prince who was arrested for piracy in Elengir. The Syomic narrative on him is that he was just standing up to standing up for himself, that they were being aggressive, unfair towards him, and he refused to comply even though it put him in danger. So you've got that as a namesake, Leorix being defiant, and Nazesi, namesake of that region right at the southern part of the Syomic states, famous city, the city of Siomzes himself. This guy is a relevant character in the current modern world events. One prince in particular, Leorix Nazesi, born in 1598, would take a great interest in the growing tension in central Atria. He and his fleet would become instrumental to the pivotal events of certain historically relevant people in the coming years. So that's a merchant prince who's sailing around the Iapyoi Sea currently, working with Tantorum, certain people, an individual named Gearlore, and really, I don't want to go into his story too much because that's spoilers, and we're going to talk about more of that stuff later. But he exists, and this is what this has amounted to. The Syomic states trade across the world. They've mapped much of the world. They've occupied, bought their freedom. They've fought the northern states. They're holding the giants back in the south. This is an interesting group of people who now have access to ancient cultural relics, and in some ways, they're simultaneously the most advanced and the most ancient traditional group here because of their connections to these ancient places, in addition to their practicality and openness because of the conflict with the giants. They feel a bit. It feels like their history is a bit hollow at parts. I'm not sure yet if that's by design, but I'm excited to see what happens to them over the course of the coming stories. The Prelude to the Trade Wars series, moving into the Trade Wars series, they're going to be a larger player than they really seem to be from anybody else's perspective. They are the wild card. Actually, throughout their whole history, they've been the wild card, so that's kind of appropriate. But yeah, that is the history of the Syom. And I don't believe I missed anything in regards to them, so that's where we're going to stop.
Hey. And then turn it up on the computer.